And we came to the conclusion from the other 4 times I've run this that it'd be really useful if people could go back through it later. And so that's the purpose of this, because buildings and energy is quite a lot. I did make the joke twice at the beginning of the week, but it's got poor now, but I'll try it again, see if I can get myself to smile, that it's like trying to summarise the works of Marcel Proust in 45 seconds, but that's a very old Monty Python joke, I think, from about 1974. Anyway, I set up Red Cooperative to try and deliver retrofits, having written oodles of reports about it. I've been at this, at sustainable construction for 30 years, and the energy stuff stands alongside it. I've also been a bit of an activist for some of that time. And so we all know we've got to do something really quick. Can you see the pictures over there, Nicola? Cool. Because I can always rotate that a bit if you want. Cool. And so, yeah, we need to crack on. We can segment what we're up to. This is 5th percentiles of the population, carbon emissions per 5% of the population by income. So the richest, as you can see, really do have something to answer for. Their emissions are up to 80 tonnes, where the rest of us are down at 10.5, and that's before we've repatriated consumption. So this doesn't include the 3.5 tonnes per person of all the stuff that we buy in from China. We've kind of made that their fault, which is a bit tight, really. Although that's where we put our working class as well, I suppose. Carbon budgets, I assume you're all familiar with the idea of a carbon budget, but just in case you're not, we have a limited amount of carbon we as a nation can emit, as indeed does anyone else on the planet. A certain amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and it all goes pear-shaped. That's what's creating the temperature rise. So if we have an equitable share, which is about 1 billion tonnes, then we've nearly used it since this graph was written in 2017, actually, for a 2/3 chance of sustaining ourselves below 1.5 degrees, which is not a surprise. We're at 1.4 this year already, and in fact, Northern Europe's at 1.9. So we are heading up this. And each one of these we head up, we obviously get a little bit longer because you can emit a little bit more carbon. So we're bouncing out of the viability of sustaining ourselves under 1.5 degrees because Paris was just a token gesture, let's be honest. And there's an awful lot coming out of our homes, once you include the small power as well, and then obviously transport. Holiday flights are a bit of a discussable thing this year. So this is the graph that Tyndall prepared for Manchester back in 2017. And their target was 13% emissions reductions year on year, starting that year. And needless to say, they've done they've achieved very little against that target. So the biggest problem we have is that actually we've been motoring our way through our budget. It's a bit like saying, well, I've got 50 quid and I've got to make that last forever. And then blowing 25 quid in the first day and then wondering how you're going to get through the rest of it. This is our problem. We've got to wean ourselves off carbon entirely and within that budget. And so we're motoring our way through. This is why the end date, the 2025, 2030, 2038, 2045, 2050, that come from various characters, actually, if you're doing this properly and you're tapering out by then, it's actually not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is we're doing nothing here. And if anyone wants to go and get themselves, I think this is the place where we have to make our voices heard and shout loudest. We can fit within our budget if we crack on. It is technically doable. Politically is another matter, and we've got to change that narrative. If this is the demand side of a thing that was written by the government, by the great David Mackay back in 2013, and we hacked it a little just to tweak some of the fairly unenterprising targets. So someone from Friends of the Earth reduced the bit that you could do by flying. The greatest switch you could do on home insulation was only a 50% reduction in heat demand, which seemed woefully inadequate, so I topped that up to the 75. That is how I currently work and is about to be. That's not COVID, that's because I've been breathing plaster dust all day. The UK Green Building Council is about to recommend, they're just out for consultation, basically a 50 kilowatt hour per square metre per annum space heating target, which is about 75% reduction of what we've currently got. And you can go to this and you can have a play yourself. It's really, really informative because you can see how little effect some of the things that people have campaigned very hard for do and how incredibly large the effects of others are. Especially when you go to power. I haven't obviously I've not put nuclear power stations in because they're not a very clever thing to be doing given the waste issues. But even if you did tick them all off because you really liked the shiny things, they take so long to build that we've launched our way through the budget already. So you then have to max out everything else, but you can actually do it. So you take your energy flows from these huge, great big flows of fossil fuels into all these places that they're needed, and you have to make them into this tiny filigree little thing where you do it all with very much smaller amounts of renewable energy and make it spread across all those places that was needed. So there's an enormous amount of demand reduction as well as an enormous amount of renewable generation to do. So starting with the renewable generation, we need quite a lot of it. It needs to be a lot of the big things, but there are small things. This is quite an old slide now, but I loved the idea that they were driving around all the takeaways in Ammanford in South Wales, collecting all of the oil from all the hotels and properly processing it, selling on the glycerin, and then having a proper diesel pump that they were allowed legally to have because it was proper diesel. It wasn't just that faint whiff of a chip pan that you get from somebody sticking sunflower oil in their Land Rover. The engineering side of things has always favoured these big projects. It keeps them in work, gets them lots of fees, but we've run out of time. This is a slide from about 15 years ago, and we've done very little to head towards them. Every so often people get very excited. Leeds currently getting very excited about hydrogen co-fueling. Pete Somerville, as I live and breathe.
Oh, Charlie, do we have
Would you like to take a pew?
sure. Just check it up on you.
That's very kind of you. I hope for marks later. You'll be wanting to look at them, mate. So that we've run out of time to do them. But we haven't run out of time to do these. We need to deploy them at a scale and with enough stress in the market to be able to lean on the Chinese that make the wafers to stop using coal-fired power station electricity to fuel the kilns that they're cooking the silicon in to make the ingots. But that is a technological fix they can do if the market tells them to do it. So that and maybe the fields full of PVs are owned by us rather than by farmers. But the point is that
just a minute. Wafers and PVs.
Photovoltaics generate electricity. They do it by very thinly sliced wafers of silicon.
Okay.
And so to get those, they have to cook fairly high-grade sand to make these big, long oblongs of glass, and then they slice them incredibly thinly so that you can get this, piezoelectric effect. I think it is piezoelectric?
Yep.
Thank you. And so you're going to get that, and that's how you get the power. And the thinner they are, the more efficient they are, and that kind of thing. But it takes an awful lot of juice to cook an enormous, great big slab of silicon. And at the moment, it means that the carbon footprint of a photovoltaic panel is about 2.5 tonnes per kilowatt, which is a bit much. It means a roof full of PV, you've got a 10-tonne carbon debt to repay, and the rest of a retrofit, even if you used a metric shit tonne of fossil fuel derived insulants, you'd still only have a 5 or 6 tonne carbon footprint on your retrofit. So it puts a big lean on it. But I'll come on
and
to
so
the
what could they do? How could they make them?
Well, they can use their own renewables to power the kilns. Hydroelectric, another good one, but an awful lot of effort. One of the things I've learned over the years I've been studying this is that actually gravity is really hard work to generate electricity with, and actually that big glowy thing in the sky is fantastic because it fuels everything. Air source heat pumps only work because the sun warms the air up, and even ground source heat pumps are simply very long interseasonal storage, inter-year storage of sun that landed on the planet a while ago. And so it's the sun. I have tried to make it work with gravity, although those lovely people with the crane in Switzerland, PowerVault I think it's called, they've basically got the sort of thing you would have made out of Lego when you were a kid that hoists 35 tonnes lumps of concrete up and down, so that when there's surplus energy they hoist it to the top, and then when they need the energy back they let the brakes go and the motor works as a dynamo. Love them. I've been waiting to actually operationalise it, and they've got a 5 megawatt test rig in Switzerland. I want a site visit, please. But in the meantime, we've got Rewley Moor. That is currently an enormous amount of electricity being generated, but we all have to look at it, but it's owned by a tax exile even, on the Isle of Man. And it'd be really nice if we could own a few of those, and I think we probably ought to think about it. So, because the renewable side of things has kind of got a momentum of its own because it makes quite a lot of money, I've been focusing on the demand reduction side, which is far less sexy, because I don't even like specifying the shiny things very often. I specify the dull fluffy stuff most of the time, and indeed have spent the day up to my elbows in dull fluffy stuff. But we can do an awful lot of things to our buildings, and there's a whole lot of regeneration available, massive numbers of jobs, some of which are skilled, but some of them are less so. Because the big thing about housing is this bit about the broken biscuit version of calories, where my mum always used to say if the biscuits were broken, they wouldn't put weight on, and it's like new build housing is like the broken biscuits of carbon, because apparently the carbon emissions from new build housing, the actual carbon to build it, doesn't count. It is starting to count finally, just like my mum had to give up on the broken biscuits. And hopefully we'll get somewhere with that, because a new home is between 50 and 80 tonnes of carbon to create. So when people say embodied carbon, the embodied carbon is the carbon that has already been emitted building the stuff we're currently in. The new stuff is not embodied carbon, it is clearly emitted carbon of somebody cooking some bricks, cutting down some trees, making some glass, melting some metals, and all the rest of it, and then transporting it, and then transporting it back, and then transporting the waste, and transporting the workforce. It's an enormous amount, and there's a weird symmetry to this, that we've got, so if say you have 20 years to get to zero, then our current carbon emissions, of which we haven't before you start peak, don't. The average house is 4.5 tonnes of carbon for the space heating. And actually, a new build passive house even, with no energy bills, could be an 80-tonne carbon footprint. So there would be no net gain in carbon emissions other than quite a lot of money got spent. So we need to be very careful when we say zero carbon new build housing. At the moment, people only mean zero operational carbon. And this graph up here is really useful, prepared by I don't even know if he owns sandals. He certainly hasn't got a woven ethnic waistcoat. He works for the RACS. This is Simon Sturgis's work. 51% of the carbon emissions of a building are building the thing. The bit that everyone's getting vexed about and having got the government for abandoning the standard on is only actually 35% of the, 33% even of the, 31%, it's been a long week. 31% of the total emissions, because this purple bit down here is just maintaining it. And so there's an enormous amount of emissions that just seem to be hidden somewhere. So, back to that. So what it means, what it clearly says therefore is retrofit, refitting, refurbishing, reusing, making better use of, whatever you want to call it, of our existing buildings is clearly the easiest way of heading us towards the target we need. And so you start with the building fabric before you put the shiny things on, but I'll come back to how much we need the shiny things. I've been doing retrofits like this one over in Trafford with a space heating demand of 40 kilowatt hours per annum, which is about an 80% reduction on where she was before it started. And it means you can take a knackered building like this wasn't hers, this is over in Levy, you can take a building that's tired and you can make a little something out of a Club Med catalogue. And the windows of the Green Building store over in Huddersfield, although Brexit is really nailing their business model, having just had some window quotes today. And then this is a house just down the road where we've insulated internally the bay and rebuilt the bay windows, had them specially made so that you haven't got forests of timber and big lumps of plastic. We got them to cut them on an angle so that we could reduce the amount of wood. And then here, where those box rooms that you get in houses where they're not useful for anything, certainly not my height, you can't lie down in any direction kind of rooms. So what we did was we insulated the loft and then put a sleeping deck in so they got a bit more space. So you can use that moment of refurbishment to do other things. Floors are a real nightmare in Manchester. Some of them are so wet you have to put a land drain in them to be able to drain them, and then in that case we use recycled glass pumice. But I went to see them the other day to check on it, and they've had that for 2 years, and their house is so much drier because it's not coming up through the floor anymore either. New windows, so there's one of those little bits. We call them Manchester windows, but I've been to Sheffield and they call them Sheffield windows. But the little leaning bit of glass over the downstairs room before you get to the rooms above, where by remaking that with triple glazing with an overhanging outer lip, we've got loads more light into the back of the house. This one, the new doors are being put on the outside of the brickwork, so they're going to be embalmed in the insulation when it comes round. If that's too expensive, as you can see, this is called the U value. This is watts, as in heat loss through this thing, per square metre of it, per degree of it that you've got, because obviously the higher the temperature differential, the more heat wheezes out of the space. So the new windows are 0.85 watts per square metre per degree. Because it's science, they make sure it's a Kelvin. It could as easily be a Celsius and everyone would understand it better, but you know what scientists are like. And I want to look like a scientist. So I use it, do as I'm told, and put a K in. But those, so you're on about, you're still halving the performance that you'd have had when we first moved in, but it's not as good as going all the way down to a sort of 15 or 20% of the energy that you were losing out of them beforehand. The other thing that keeps getting missed off is the cold bridging. And this has a psi value, I was told by my Greek co-worker once upon a time. I thought it was a psi value, but she said, no, it's psi. And that is the little bits of heat that leave through all of the junctions. So when you get to the floor, when the walls join in, when you get to the roof, the bits round the windows, all of that. And you wouldn't believe how much heat. So when they have publicly funded schemes, they're paid by the square metre, not by the watts saved. So they leave a nice big gap above the bay window because they can't be bothered to detail it properly. And they even leave a gap underneath the Benco box and the cable inlet. And then they stop it just above the DPC, which in a lot of these older houses is above floor level anyway. So you get, in future, you get a little black line where you get condensation along that bit later.
DPC, what's that?
Damp-proof course.
Damp-proof course.
Anyone that's bought a house has been told by their mortgage provider, thou shalt have a damp-proof course, otherwise thou shalt not have thy house. Unless you're borrowing little enough money to go, which I did.
What, paying in cash?
I didn't pay in cash, but my other half was better at this than me. So this is a thermal image, so it shows where it's cold. So that's the eaves, where you couldn't get into the roof to insulate it. That's one of the rafters, so it's even colder in the gaps in between, but very cold as it goes over the top. These were double glazed units, but very thin, with the shiny spaces, where now you can get these things called warm edge spaces. So there's also a whole load of heat weeing out of there. So if you add all of those blue bits up around a house, you can get to quite a lot of underperformance. Services, you don't want to stick the scruffy saw pipes on the outside of your new Club Med brochure. So in our case, we actually put an aerobittance valve in about there, and then buried it all under locally grown larch. Air dried as well, just to keep your carbon footprint down. And that, in that case, not even finished, although it's not aging as well as I want it to. We've almost all got chimneys in Manchester. It's great, and so we can use them for ventilation. So in this case, that's a moisture-sensitive extract, so it only opens when it needs to, and then lets the air up out the chimney. In this case, we're using the underfloor void as well, so that we're preheating the air on the way in. We have to be a bit careful about that, because if you've got the wrong kind of damp under your floor, you can bring dodgy fungus into the house. PV is then, here's a shiny thing. I've got all this way before I've done the shiny thing. I've done the fabric first. Here's the shiny things. This was an install I did for Unicorn Grocery about 10 years ago now, when feed-in tariff was right up there, and they are feeding that money back into their works pension quite comfortably. Nowadays there's no feed-in tariff, and so you have to have a battery as well, so you can up your self-consumption. But there's more to go with that. And then, if you can stomach losing most of your garden for quite a while, you can go for a ground source heat pump. If you can't, and also you need quite a lot of money that you're not going to need for a bit to do one of those, you could go for an air source heat pump. It does remind me a bit like those compressors that sit on the outside of the pub to keep the beer cold, but they are a relatively cost-effective way of doing it, and you can get very quiet ones on it. And you can get to a zero carbon retrofit, so we can take our existing housing and make it actually zero. We can take all of those emissions and get rid of them entirely, other than what we emitted to get it there, but there wouldn't be any after that. By either just turning lots of stuff off, or getting some energy efficient appliances if we can afford them, but obviously not throwing away the one that's still working quite well. Hot water, spray taps. Some spray taps are better than other spray taps. So some, it takes you a week to fill the sink, or standing under a shower feeling like you're being spat at by an angry wasp. In this case, though, you can get better ones that aerate it properly, so that you can reduce your hot water demand. That's still quite a lot of water, quite a lot of baths. And then by reducing the space heating demand, so in this case, this is a terrace house. In fact, this is the space heating demand for the one I showed at the beginning. And you can get that down to 2.2 megawatt hours of space heating. If you then provide the heat and hot water with a heat pump, which is a fridge in reverse. So imagine, although not in my house, but imagine that the bit that you're living in is the bit with all the spiders and fluff down the back of the fridge, and the outside air is the inside of the fridge. It's that effect. And the COP means coefficient of performance, and that means that in this case, 100 watts of energy put into the heat pump will produce 375 watts of heat, because it grabbed the rest out of the air on the way past. And that then means that you can reduce the total energy you need to run your house for a year to what you can get off your roof if you can get 5 kilowatts of PV onto it, which is quite a squeeze, and Electricity North West would like you to stop at 3.8, but if you've got a battery, you can promise them not to fry their grid. So we can take, with a combination of that demand reduction, the renewable energy and the storage, We can get to zero carbon by 2038, and where I'm about to take you, in a sec, where I'm about to take you, we can eradicate fuel poverty entirely, so you don't have to keep topping it up. You can just get rid of it in 10 years, and I just need the public purse to pay for training the workforce, because I couldn't get that into the budget.
What was the reason for stopping at 3.8? What's their reason for that?
They've just got a rule about how many amps you can put into the grid, or indeed take off it, so they don't want more than 15 amps coming out of an individual house.
Is that a reasonable rule, in your opinion?
I can see the point, but they could be more granular about it. But you can imagine that given that they've got lots of other things to do, you can have more, but you have to apply to them. So it means you get you'll get pretty much a rubber stamp for 15 amps and below. If you want to go above, you've got to go and ask nicely and prove how you're not going to fry their grid on a sunny day. Because you can imagine if everybody had PV on their roofs and some of them were a bit above, and that poor little transformer down the end of the road when the sun was beaming out like it was in June, you could quite comfortably do a bit of harm unless things turn themselves off. I mean, it's all right. So the problem with retrofit is each half of energy you save is the same price as the next half. So when you're going for 50%, it's there. When you go for the next 75%, it's the same again, and then the same again, and the same again each time. And so you end up with this exponential curve, which means that quite a lot of people are not going to try and go that far. I mean, obviously you can go off the top of this and spend £475,000 on a single retrofit, but you don't need to. That's just somebody with more money than sense. And you don't need to go and look at it, but I won't name him because it's being filmed and that'd be mean. You just know where it is, it's on Setland Road. If you then need to borrow the money to do that, this is where you get to compare your incoming and your outgoings and your outgoings. So if you're going to service that with a high street mortgage, then to get to a sort of a 70% reduction, you're going to be spending about 1,500 quid on cost recovery, but you'll still have some bills left over because you only hit 70%. If, however, that lovely public sector that used to borrow money by the truckload to build the social housing of the 60s and 70s was allowed to do such things again, and one could argue it's about time we got there, and had we had a different government, we might get there, but not for a bit, so we're going to have to do this ourselves, I think. But you can then reduce that borrowing, or reduce the cost of that borrowing, or borrow more and get further up the curve. Because obviously, if you're just saying I want to have 50% of my bills, 75% of my bills, that's a simple linear curve. So what it means is that there's a point where the amount you're saving will pass the amount it's costing you to have made that saving. And obviously, for this to be something that everyone can afford, and we can come on to the fuel poverty in a bit, we need to try and peg it at what people are paying for their utilities now. So those sweet spots move if we can reduce the cost of finance. If we add in the PV and the batteries, we can get a little bit further, but we've had to pay for the PV and the battery while we were there. If, however, we can federate 400 homes upwards and then have them remote controlled by software and obviously set up a reasonably accountable enterprise that means that we know what they're doing with our energy, then you can move that sweet spot right up here. So public funding and federated energy storage, you're functionally right next to net zero. Obviously, these graphs are all approximate. I'm trying to make things graphic to understand, so don't pick the maths on me. Costs are actually way too high. I mean, even me doing them and rarely getting paid for them, it's still too high. We're currently doing a project which we're still going to start honest, where we're going to try and rehearse this, but we're going to be at this price point. The point at which it gets... Bays agree with us that in the next 10 years we should be able to halve the cost of retrofit by making sure that if we can get the bottlenecks that we haven't just walked into by Brexit sorted, then, and also a labour force that knows what they're doing more and has rehearsed it more, has got better at it, and then obviously getting more innovation in there, also getting joined up IT so that you can make sure things run smoothly all the way through and monitor what they're doing, not to pay several times. So if you were to therefore borrow money at any of those years where the price is reduced, you'll see that if you actually had your retrofit done in year 6 with some very cheap institutional finance like Public Works Loan Board used to get, then it breaks even. And so we're nearly there. It's not a huge leap we have to make to get there. So if we start low and then scale it up, just enough to get the market developed, but not so much we bankrupt ourselves, we can do this, especially if we roll out the PV and the storage before we roll out the retrofits, which does get me drummed out the retrofit brownies for doing the shiny things first, But I did plan to do the fabric first, just financially you need to do the shiny things first. And the other thing about doing this is this then generates an income to run the programme, so we haven't got to wait for Rishi to go back to his magic money orchard and see if us ordinary people can have a bit of it. We can actually crack on, which is the most important thing about this, that everyone's been waiting for government programmes before getting on with it, rather than going, right, what is a sustainable pathway to getting this to move, let's get on with it. The nice thing about doing it that way as well is that here is Tyndall's 13% a year decrease curve. It's really quite scary. This is why whether it's 2025 or 2038 is nowhere near as important as this bit. Because the amount of emissions in that column there is all of the emissions in those last 5 years. And we're not making any inroads into these. So let's stop arguing about this bit and really get some pressure on this bit. Because that's the bit that's terrifying me, is we are just not even close. However, if we can do this, at least my residential retrofit doesn't just head off at a tiny number while I'm building the market and then go down. I can at least accelerate that curve. And the nice thing about all that income, especially if I can get enough people inside the same finance model, I can eradicate fuel poverty in the first 10 years. I've built models to prove this. However, it's complicated. So there's cards about whether that's as far as you want to go. So the idea is you're going to pick these cards and give yourself a game of patience, and you're going to deal the cards to yourself, and if you like them, you're going to put them at the top of the pile, and if you're not so keen, put them at the bottom, or if you don't like them at all, just leave them to one side. And then we take a photograph of this at the end to see who liked what. So that it's as democratic as I can do this in such a short space of time. Because if we could do a couple of day residential weekend, I wouldn't need the cards and we could start from scratch, but you'd probably lose the will to live because it's as you can see, some of it's, yeah. Anyway, lots of things we need to do. So again, there's some cards about doing some of this, not all of it, but I thought it was useful just to show you how much we have to build up to make this work. We need action across lots of fronts. There's lots of people looking for this thing they call a magic bullet, which worries me a little. And I've said there's not even a magic gun, mate, never mind a magic magazine. It's not even a gun. It's just a lot of people working together, and actually guns, therefore, completely the wrong metaphor. We need to get people in it, and the great news on this point is, did anyone do marketing at college? Did anyone do the Rogers adoption curve, the Rogers innovation curve?
Anybody?
This thing where 2.5% of the population are the ones camped outside the Apple shop when the iPhone was first launched. And then the next 13.5% are called the early adopters, and they are the ones that really want it, but they're not prepared to camp outside the Apple store. And then you get people who go, that's quite cool, isn't it? I quite like that. I like to be a little bit new, but I don't want to do it so new that they're the ones that wait for the second edition of the operating system before they go for it, those kinds of people. Then there's the people who go, oh, go on then, that's probably better. And then your last section are the ones that go, nope, you're not coming in. And whenever you often see this on neighbourhood improvement schemes, that somebody will have been one of those, and so everyone else has had their new swanky house refit, and then there's just a gap because they went, no, not having it, go away, not having it, don't want it, don't want it. And so you can legislate for them later, and we can build our retrofit industry. Actually, in Greater Manchester, they've just done market research. Matt Lipson has just proved that there are 3% of the Greater Manchester population wanting a deep retrofit and wanting it now. Weirdly, the policymakers will go, look, there's only 40% want any retrofit at all. And we're thinking, we're not building 60,000 property retrofits next year because we haven't got a workforce. We need to build this carefully, and so there's these lovely innovators I'd like to go and find to get them moving first. But we've got to be nice to them. The problem with the Green Deal is that nobody was nice to anybody, because they were building this on the back of the old eco-funded schemes that were free. And so basically, contractors turned up your house, did a crap job, because there's no point in complaining because you weren't paying for it anyway. And in the case of Fishwick in Preston, 400 and odd homes, they're having to take the insulation off. It was done so badly. But now people have got to pay for it. We've actually got to completely change the relationship between the service deliverer and the customer, which is so far away from what's going on, and it terrifies me frequently. I'm trying to make sure that we get to a position where everyone has a whole house assessment plan. So even if you can't afford the retrofit now, you've got a plan. You know what you've got to do, so that if you have got a bit of money, you do find a couple of grand down the back of the sofa, as you do when you do your spring cleaning, then you can nip out there and do the underfloor, because that doesn't rely on anything else. I'm nearly there on internal wall insulation so that you can fit the windows later, because windows are flipping expensive, and in fact my favourite supplier is having supply chain problems, and their prices have just gone up 35%. Which is annoying. But it means that you can do stuff in stages. Data is also crucial. We keep doing all these programs and we never monitor what we're doing. We need to get that data, gather it somewhere, so we need to find lots and lots of those geeky types that none of us ever thought had any use at all. They're really useful here if we can get them deployed to help out with this, and then they can even get themselves completely giddy on all of the other data that might get killed by the authority. They said, oh, we don't think we can do anything about that. So, well, yeah, you can, because if you capitalise a lending vehicle, you can make access to that finance conditional on getting the job done properly. Anyway. So I'm quite keen on developing something like the old school building society savings, where we'd have a retrofit loan fund that built up capital because you got your PV on in advance and you can save up your retrofit that way too. But what I want to be able to do is lend to those that are able to pay, so that if they've already got their own money in the bank, then what I'd like them to do is buy some retrofit bonds, because then I can use those retrofit bonds to help these people out. But also, if you bought when the market was too high, so you've got no asset cover, so you can't actually extend your mortgage, then we need access to, for those people, to have access to some money. And then as you head into the sort of the fuel poverty isn't a straight binary, as government policy says. It's a spectrum of increasing levels of difficulty covering your heating bills. And so we should offer a spectrum of lending products so that people do that. So there's some cards on that. But how do we do this? Is this private? Is it social? Is it public? The thing I like once you've done that is if you are then lending into lots of houses, maybe a maintenance service would be handy, because if you've lent out squillions into houses, you're not going to want the value of those houses to drop because the occupant doesn't know how to look after them. So we could also then help people out learn to look after their houses, especially once we've deployed 33,000 people regionally on retrofit. Once we've done the retrofits, some of them will want to carry on in the field. So there's a whole load of work there. Obviously they'll be moving on to the commercial properties, but and then we maybe even be able to do some work with private landlords. Not all of them, not the really nasty ones, but some of the micro landlords, the ones who've just got a couple of properties. And then there's lots of places to get the money from, so you can pick some cards on that. We need to make it scalable. And then the big one, the third one, the big ones are additional revenue, access to cash, and workforce. We are 250,000 people short nationally of a viable construction workforce, and even the Construction Leadership Council reckons that we need 700,000 in retrofit, so that's just over 1 million. I actually think it's nearer 1 million in retrofit too, so that's 1.2 million new bods. So when they say, well, we're going to sort out apprentice schemes, who are you apprenticing these people to? It doesn't work. So we tried to take some theatre workers, which we did quite well at, and this will actually, I don't have to play the video on the PDF, you'll have to try it, because that'd be cool, because we haven't got time for that now. But it's only me talking anyway, and you've had enough of that by now. No, there, thank you. The premise of the training we've been trying to work out is that you take all of that suite of measures that you're going to do if you're wanting a zero carbon house, and you're going to then say, well, I've got roofers, I've got plasterers, I've got brickies, I've got sparkies, my usual trades. Most of the work on a retrofit can be done by them with minimal additional skilling, if we had enough of them. But it does mean that we're not talking about a complete change in what we're doing for skills, just some additions to them. So of the bits on the top of the house, there's a few left over that don't make it into the, where's my mouse? There we go. So there's a few that then we're not quite sure where to put those. And similarly on the external wall insulation, who does the below ground? Is it a ground worker or is it the joiner? And in fact, insulation fitting is probably one of the ones that is a skill set by itself, because it needs to be done properly. Air tightness, knowing how not to embalm yourself in very sticky tapes. And then all of these other bits on the mechanical and electrical side, that's what M&E stands for, just in case anyone was wondering, sorry about that. And then underfloors, there isn't a trade for people doing underfloor insulation. Scrawny former bike messengers have been my previous go-to place for underfloor insulators, but some of them have now got training, got better jobs. So there is a guy from the Lowry, that's Al, and that's Mad Mike, who does events. He's gone back to work on events, but Al took redundancy, so he's now a member of Red Co-op. And we've then cut the skills up into pieces, and then I've tried to redesign the systems so that I can make use of the skills we've got. And we're just starting work with a company called B4Box, who employ long-term unemployed ex-offenders and care leavers and train them up in construction. So I'm hoping that we might have found both a way of doing good with retrofit, but also generating a workforce. Because we need to do it all now. We can do more than just the retrofit though, we can use that opportunity. So one of the other things is under occupation of property, or people wanting lofts, wanting to make better use of the buildings that we've got. And we can also stop knocking down all the buildings in the city centre and make them look nicer too, and have a bit of fun while we're there, and make nice staircases and do the nice things while we were there, because we were saving money by not knocking the building down. And then there's all those community centres. This is in Marple. ridiculously underused but beautiful volume of space, but flipping cold and they can't afford to heat it. So in need of a retrofit, and maybe even growing food in abandoned office buildings. It never came through, but one day, and that's it. Sorry that went on. So your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to deal yourself a hand of cards and then decide which cards you fancy the most.
Can you take any questions, Joe?
I can take questions too, but what I want you to do, I'll do the questions once you're moving, because obviously I'm here for the duration. But I think I would have, given how long I've gone on for, apologies, it's been a very long week.
Just remind us what the federated, the second plank was. It's the public funding and federated
Energy storage,
energy storage.
so that we can collectively own the means of production. It's a kind of clause 4 for energy, really. And so we can then basically also, I mean, it's a direct challenge to the big six, I'll be honest, but it's about time. And there's plenty of other new entrants into the market. I think the hegemony of the big six has been quite well challenged now. So, given that I don't want to keep you here for too long, it is basically whistle through this lot. We've got 25 minutes.
So we're taking a path.
So, yeah, the idea
I
is,
apologise, but what are we doing with these cards?
You're basically going to deal themselves out to yourself. If you like the look of it, put it at the top of the table. And then if you like another one, more than it, put it above it and move the other one down. If you like it less, put it below it. And if you're not very keen on it at all, put it to one side but maybe have a look at it later. We have had a variety of responses on this. Some people have put all 66 cards down and had all of them and then arranged them in a different order. Other groups have gone, well, in like, I think the smallest number we've had was about 15.
We've got in order for each of 4 categories.
That's entirely up to you. It makes Bob's life easier when he comes to then, this is effectively you voting on measures. So we've done, this is the 5th workshop we've done this week with up to 5 groups. So we've got loads of these, and the reason for having the cards like this is it makes it much, much easier to assess what is the most popular measure and what is the least popular.
it's still going to be a very long weekend for me, but it does make it easier. So each of the packs then, if you take one at a time and then look through them, and then it's about ranking them in, one pack, deal all of them out and see which you think are the most important. So if you two want to work as a 2,
How long have we got to do this contract?
yeah.